Following the address of the guest of honor, we will now have the address by the chief guest. To introduce to us our chief guest for the evening, who is one of Sri Lanka's best-known pediatricians, we now again invite the president of the Jaffna Medical Association to the podium. Over to you, madam.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce Vidyajothi Professor Harendra Silva. He studied at Ananda College, Colombo and qualified from the University of Colombo in 1975 with second-class honours. He proceeded to the UK on a Commonwealth Scholarship in 1980, worked at the Institute of Child Health in Birmingham and completed the MRCP and the MSc as well. His study was on overgrowth of small intestine with enteropathogenic E. coli in chronic diarrhea. He joined the University of Ruhuna in 1983 and worked for 16 years. 29 years ago, he described the cause of hemolytic uremic syndrome in Shigella-Shiga dysentery as due to cytokine IL-6 and TNF, and postulated the multi-system involvement due to high levels of cytokines, as well as local production of cytokines in the gut with local DIC, thrombosis, and necrosis for the first time in the world. He was the lead author for this in Lancet and Gut. He described the prevalence of various aspects of child abuse in Sri Lanka, which made the government to change the policy on child protection that led to establishment of the Task Force on Child Abuse and National Child Protection Authority, where he served as the founder chairman. He was primarily responsible to change and create at least 10 laws pertaining to child abuse. He also described for the first time in the world that conscription of children in war is child abuse, and described another new definition of child abuse, suicide by proxy. This work changed the way the world looked at conscription. He now is the Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics at University of Colombo, served a short period as President SLMC from 2019 to 2020. Of the many international fellowships he has been awarded, the Honorary Fellowship of Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health for outstanding work on child protection. Fellowship of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Pakistan stands out. He has received many international and local awards, for which the following are outstanding. Most Outstanding Asian Pediatrician Award by the Asian Pediatrics Association in 2003, Senior Ashoka Fellow for Social Entrepreneurship by the Ashoka Foundation, Washington, D.C., Distinguished Career Award by the International Society Against Child Abuse and Neglect, Committee of Vice Chancellors and Directors Award for Most Outstanding Research in Medicine 2008, Finalist Award in the British Medical Journal Lifetime Achievement Award 2010. Recently, he was conferred the national honor Vidyajothi for outstanding scientific and technological achievements. He has published about 100 papers, has described many diseases in Sri Lanka for the first time and in Asia. He has been an author and editor of 11 books, booklets, and has contributed chapters to 16 books both locally and internationally. He has delivered more than 10 orations, both locally and internationally. He remains an outspoken child and human rights activist. Professor Harendra Silva has trained many of us, and I am proud to say I was one of his trainees. I kindly call you, sir, to deliver your talk to this esteemed audience. Over to you, sir.
Professor Gitanjali Satyadas, members of the Council of the GMA, important guests in the audience, as well as others who will be presenting on Zoom. Let me first thank everybody, including the Council, for having invited me to speak to you today. I won't take long, but my first impressions, my first visit to Jaffna was by train when I was a student in school, and you'll be surprised. My mother's friend, Miss Mabel Tambaya, accommodated us in a classroom in the Burmbody School during our stay. Of course, it was during holidays. Sorry. Of course, after that, there were many visits during our medical student days, including a 2-week holiday. And then, of course, what was important was we established when I was Chairman Child Protection Authority, we established one of the first regional child protection societies in Jaffna, with the help of Professor Dayas Sundaram, as well as those days Mr. Surendra Kumaran, now Professor, I think, and the Dean, who helped in establishing the Child Protection Committee of Jaffna. And then during one of those visits, I think I went on Surendra Kumaran's scooter and came to the faculty and delivered 2 lectures back to back, one on child protection, one on intestinal diarrheas. Thank you for the invitation again. And of course, Geeta told me about my involvement with the exams. I think the previous speaker spoke about good governance as well in the medical field. I'm going to talk about good governance in the medical field, as well as how it affects in daily life, in our families, society, as well as in general society, as well as in politics. First of all, I'll introduce a few important concepts. The principles would be, first of all, would be transparency, and then no conflicts of interest when we work, which we have forgotten, and we have to work according to the rule of the law, or there should not be any impunity. And then accountability is another issue, where if we have done good, we are accountable. If we have done bad, we are accountable to that as well. And of course, monitoring is an essential prerequisite at every level of this audits. Everything would be notebooks, attendance registers, would be all part of monitoring, CCTV. And then transparency can reduce the need for monitoring. If we are transparent, we don't have to monitor that much. And then, of course, accountability will minimize impunity. I have used this as a symbol of governance without having to explain it all the time. And we as individuals should be transparent to ourselves, of course. And then we have to be transparent to our parents, spouse. When we are kids, we have to be transparent to our parents, and so on and so forth as children. And then we have to be transparent to patients, and we have to explain things, talk to them. We have to be transparent to staff, superiors, as well as government. And then ultimately to the people and society. Of course, we have to wear clothes. We can't be totally transparent. We need to avoid or declare conflicts of interest, that is being transparent. And then we should act within the norms and laws set by the family, because we have norms at the family level, and friends, society, or government. And we should be accountable or face consequences to ourselves, family, friends, society, and also finally government. Is good governance applicable to only the central government, ministry, hospitals, community, or self? So I think what I'm trying to explain is it applies across the board to everybody. If you take hospitals, is it the director, consultants, medical officers, nurses, or minor staff? I will explain by one. And when I say good governance, it should apply to everybody, as well as it may appear hypothetical, but although difficult, because we are just used not applying those standards, and therefore we feel it only hypothetical, but it is practical. Then it is not necessarily politicians. We talk about governance, we think about politicians, not necessarily politicians who cause poor governance. A dysfunctional family, the family medicine and public health people will know a lot about dysfunctional families, is due to poor governance at a micro level. And then, however, it is the responsibility of the government to provide education, skills, and help them to bail out from the vicious cycles. And it is also important to monitor the vulnerable, enforce the law when it matters, but it equally should apply from top to bottom. We also have to understand the real meaning of good governance, not just a meaningless word, because we should not romanticize the word good governance or use it as a symbol to politicize it and gain power, as what happened in 2015, where even the people who promoted it did not know the meaning of good governance. They used that word as a romantic word. Now, if you take a family unit, there is the mother, the father, the extended family, and the children. I use the extended family in a developing country level. And then these are the symbols of good governance. And then the mother and father would monitor the children, and the children would also monitor each other, the elder child monitoring the younger child. And then what will happen is, we'll keep an eye on the children or siblings, whether it's the parents or the other siblings or extended family. They would look at the grades or school performance and measurement and behaviors, fight, screen time. We say screen time 1 hour, it's difficult with the COVID time. And then we make them accountable for not doing it right or doing it right in a negative fashion or a positive fashion. But this accountability process should be to correct them, but not punish physically or emotionally, which is very often done, which is a concept which was previous, and I used to address it during my period at the Child Protection Authority. I still continue to do that. Then the mother and father, there is a governance part. They would monitor each other, also the extended family, and they would monitor each other. And then what would they monitor? They would monitor for infidelity, spending patterns, the credit cards, drinking excessively or whatever, and then their behaviors, fight within the family and outside and so on, as well as nowadays the ladies look at the phone logs of the men and vice versa. And these are all forms of monitoring. And if things are not going well, the accountability process would end up in counseling or discussions, or if this doesn't work, the accountability will be a divorce. I'm going to give just a few examples of the importance of the trickle-down effect of setting examples. Can a father discipline a child for stealing from his purse when He steals public money by taking bribes. Very easy answer. Can a mother discipline a daughter for having a boyfriend when she has promiscuous relationships? A breakdown in a family unit, i.e., a dysfunctional family, as I mentioned before, is essentially due to an unaccountable apex, that is the parents, the leadership, and so on. And then it is essential that the apex or the parents ensure the trickle-down effects of transparency, rule of the law, and accountability. I'm not talking about the government or the legal rule of the law, but these are family rules. And accountability to reach grassroots. That means the children by setting examples. Let's take, for example, a hospital. We have the director. We have the consultant, house officers, sisters, nurses, minor staff. Again, we use the measures of governance in monitoring them, and that would be monitoring the attendance register of the minor staff, monitoring them individually maybe, delivery of samples to the lab, collection of reports from the lab, logbooks that they usually maintain, as well as their behavior, bribery, and however the documentation in these areas is poor, partly because of trade unions and fear of trade unions. And then they look at the accountability, which would be complaint to the director or the matron, punishments, increment stops, and confirmations not given. Often it is an issue because the documentation is poor. Consultants will monitor the house officers and look at punctuality, professional behavior such as examining patients, treatment procedures, ethical behavior, commitments, interactions with patients and staff, and of course, as a result of that, in the process of accountability, they could refuse to sign up and report to either the director or the Sri Lanka Medical Council. Then the director will monitor the consultants in the same way. Whether it happens or not is another issue. And then the monitoring process would be of the director would be the statistics he has to give, the tenders that he calls where it should be transparent, audits and so on, and the provincial director will look at the accountability of the director and it moves upway. So this triangle would be connected to another pyramid at a higher level. And then there will be accountability. And then can a director insist on punctuality of the interns when senior doctors are not in the ward during working hours? And can the director or the consultant insist on proper communication with patients and staff when he or she is abusive to subordinates? Open tenders with multiple independent evaluators who have no conflicts of interest is the basis of the transparency in good governance, not closed tenders as it is happening today. It need not be Sri Lanka, it could be any developing country. I'm not being very specific to our country, but if you want to apply it, yes. And then, however, today corruption has led to hand-picked tenderers using various loopholes and impunity with conflicts of interest. Sometimes the administrator himself may be the tenderer on the other side. Now, a breakdown and functioning of an institution, or in other words, a hospital, is again, which means a dysfunctional unit, is essentially due to unaccountable apex, that is the administration. It is essential that the apex ensure the trickle-down effects of transparency, rule of the law, accountability reach the grassroots, i.e. the interns, nurses, and minor staff by setting examples. Governance in society is the bigger picture of small units of such as this, of self-governance, coalescing and moving upwards synchronously towards the peak. However, the hierarchy in the peak needs to be equally accountable, which complements the base. I'm looking at the first king of Sri Lanka. Was Vijaya made accountable for his evil deeds by his father, who exiled him from Singapore, if you know a bit of history. He was chased away for bad behavior by the father. So he was made accountable by the father, although he was a prince. And then did King Elaran, or used to be known as Elara, make his son accountable when he ran over a calf on his chariot. Of course, I don't agree with the way in which he made him accountable. However, the accountability process was there. Now, similarly, these little modules that are there, which may be the family, then the institutions, and then the ministries maybe, and the apex of government. This is how it works together. And the integrity and accountability at the top trickles down to the grassroots. One cannot expect accountability at the bottom unless forcibly imposed on them, which will be short-lived since it would lead to an uprising if it goes on for too long. When the hierarchy demands accountability from the bottom, it is justifiable. That is how it should happen. But then provided they too are accountable. If not, I call it unaccountable accountability. It's a bit confusing maybe. Unaccountable people demanding accountability from the bottom is unaccountable accountability. That's phrase I coined myself. This is Mr. Trump. Most presidents, this is a CNN report, most presidents don't pardon murderers. Trump did, and they may do it again. That was one of the reports. And in this one, he pardoned a man who killed a prisoner. I don't want to go into detail for the sake of time. And then subsequently, he endorsed the use of torture for what he called terrorists, or maybe freedom fighters, whatever you may call it, right? And then he also pardoned 4 murderers who killed 17 civilians who were convicted of murder. Now, the authoritative law given to the US president, or maybe any other country, you may apply it the way you want, the right to pardon a murderer, thereby giving the murderer the right to kill. What about the rights of the aggrieved party? What about the integrity of the US president? Is he accountable? I'm putting a question to you. If you look at another aspect of accountability and governance in the health sector, I think the previous speaker also spoke on that to some extent in a different mode. Let's look at the duties of an epidemiologist in today's world. We have to investigate diseases, collecting data for tests, developing a plan of action, but there should be scientific randomization of screening tests, whether it's PCR or dengue or whatever, to look at that. Scientific randomization, mark my words. And there should be transparency of the epidemiological data. Everybody should be able to see the correct data, not concocted data. And allow proper professional inputs in the health system. We need to create reports about the potential spread of disease, correct professional reports. And then we have to communicate these findings to policymakers and public. So policymakers come at the end, not before. Again, not Sri Lanka. And then we have to have a firm policy on administration of vaccines without deviations. We saw people going off queue, favorites getting injection, the COVID vaccine, so and so. May not be Sri Lanka, could be India. Again, you apply wherever it is. Shouldn't the health function on the rules of law and transparency in the absence of conflicts of interest and accountability? Are authorities allowing us to be professionals today? Or are we passive perpetrators? That's another word I coined, where we do nothing. We see the bad things happening, but we do nothing. We just accept it. And I call those people, especially the professionals and the intellectuals, as passive perpetrators. Then going again on health policy during the pandemic, vaccination policy. Is there a policy? Is there a forward plan? Right to know, we can't be changing policy every day. Today, one age group, tomorrow another age group, and so on. And we need to know the prices of the vaccines, purchase protocols, and transparency of tenders, which maybe we are not seeing in the developing countries. We need to know the policy of quarantine in hotels, who owns the hotels, how are the hotels selected, what are the prices they have to quote, and so on and so forth. We need to know that. We need transparency. We know that businesses, and including professionals, including doctors, fish in troubled waters. You know what it means. Hospital bills. I don't know whether it happens in Jaffna. In Colombo, it's rampant. The price of drugs. There is no transparency or accountability. Somebody goes in for a sickness and gets 3 million for 5 days and a 3 million bill. And it just says drugs, general, no specifics, no transparency, 700,000 or 800,000 rupees. There is no transparency. Should there be? Who should ensure that transparency? Then we have been using decoctions promoted by people. This history shows this. Long time ago, all these cholera epidemics and so on, people have used various decoctions which was of no use, but fishing in troubled waters, right? We have ethical committees. We are not gone through ethical committees, and the governance has approved it and promoted it. And what's wrong with that? What are we not challenging it, right? And non-evidence-based medicines are developed and promoted. Even today, medical doctors are promoting non-ethical, non-evidence-based medicines in the media, and nothing is happening to them. They have also conflicts of interest. If we cannot keep these criteria, it becomes poor governance. If you don't address these issues that I mentioned. Who is accountable? What is the process of complaints that we can make? Has any one of you made any complaints about anything or the wrongdoings that are happening today? According to the Bribery Commission, conflicts of interest in law is considered as bribery. Are we even thinking about it? Have we even considered that? Have we applied it? No. In an era where mediocre professionals write PhD theses based on apparent dreams and messages from supernaturals, not necessarily in Sri Lanka, but maybe in another developing country. National decisions on agriculture are made by uneducated, non-professional politicians based on such pseudoscience without heeding real professionals. Again, could be another country. Who will be accountable for the manslaughter? By definition, it would be manslaughter if we have a famine and a series of deaths. Who will be accountable? Then I'm going into territories, insecurity, territorialism, and governance. We all are insecure, whether we are in America, Australia, whatever the country we live in, we are all insecure. From what? We are insecure from environmental disasters, floods, tsunamis, whatever, epidemics, pandemics, diseases, human attacks, which could be physical attacks, intellectual and professional attacks, as well as monetary attacks. So we need to build territories for survival or boundaries. I'm not saying not to do it. So how do we do that? We make dams, breakwaters, shelters for environmental disasters, epidemics and diseases, vaccines, drugs, and health staff. Physical attacks, we have weapons, walls, guards. Intellectual, we educate ourselves to prevent intellectual attacks, and we have virus guards in our computers. And then we have banks, safes, investments, insurance for monetary attacks in the event of a monetary attack. So this is inevitable. It happens. And this is an example of a physical protection. All humans, including Homo sapiens, are territorial for security and survival. Professionals, too, can be very aggressive, including doctors, and protective if and when somebody treads on its territory. I am using the word it because that professional is behaving more like an animal rather than a human. That's why I am using that word. My family, my wife, my child is unchallenged territory. I'm not saying that it is not territory. It is our territory. I protect them. But am I the owner? This is a question. What right have I got to abuse my child or my wife? Although they are my territory. I think it's important to understand, because today's, especially developing countries or even developed countries, most of the abuse and domestic violence is based on the concept or the notion that we own our family members. Similarly, what right have I got over my patients? Or is it the right of patients over us? Which should be the correct thing. But we don't think like that, do we? By trying to safeguard my own boundary, somebody is trying to attack me, I, in the process, may cross the other's boundary. How does that happen? If another person challenges my integrity, just a challenge, what right have I to assault him or her physically? So I am crossing his boundary by trying to protect my boundary. The vicious cycle of insecurity and corruption is another thing that is happening all over the world, not necessarily in Sri Lanka. When we have an incompetent leader, I'm not talking about the country, maybe if it applies, the ministry, whether it is the head of a department, whether it's in the university. When you have an incompetent leader, you become because you are incompetent, you are insecure, you are paranoid, you try to stabilize yourself by other ways. Therefore, you will not get competent professionals as advisors. Instead, you will have equally incompetent, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full people. And I call them minions. I don't know whether you have all seen this Despicables video and the minions. If you are not sure of that, I will define what minions are. Minions, by definition, are loyally save the greatest villains, always trying to do evil, but their idiocy is hilarious. That's why some people like them. And you can see that in the social media that we get all the time, right? Some of these minions are ridiculed, and just to make us happy. When there are, let's say, in a country, hypothetical country, medical professionals in parliament, why is that a totally ignorant non-doctor is the minister? Because it is essential for the hierarchy to manipulate power, politics, without addressing real professional aspects. But these yes sir, no sir people are corrupt. That's why they are there. And they promote you or the leaders to be corrupt. Not necessarily in Sri Lanka. It happens in India, Pakistan, all over. Pakistan try to grapple with the problem. And they cover you up. They protect you. And how do they cover? They use the power and overrule law and order. They use transparency is of no consequence to them. They don't know that word. They think it doesn't exist. And accountability processes are hindered by manipulation of justice. It further consolidates corruption. The trickle-down effect of corruption, impunity, lack of transparency, and lack of accountability will reach down to the grassroots and will affect the country. It applies from high officials, doctors, professionals, intellectuals, academics, down to minor staff. Across the board, the same thinking patterns exist, same practices exist. Is the system that we live in this world, too corroded to reverse or to correct? Just asking you to think. We can make a change without making religion or race symbolic. Our biggest hindrance is the primitive reptilian brain or the almond-sized amygdala in the hypothalamus, which is a scoundrel. But it is the one that has protected right throughout evolution for our survival, the reptilian brain. It has often been manipulated, however, by power wielders using bigotry and racism. Bigotry, is various religious, anti-religious connotations. Almost, think back, in the region, in the world, almost all riots were based on race or religion. There were leaders behind them. Almost all rebellions were based on nationalism, race, religion, or social divide. There were leaders behind them. Almost all leaders came to power, especially in developing countries, especially India and Sri Lanka, whatever, right? With a cry for language. You can remember 50s, cry for language. Indirect or direct racism and bigotry. Sensationalism stimulates the amygdala in humans to release dopamine. Clergy is often used. People then function at the level of the hypothalamus with little use of the forebrain. Fake news and sensationalism stimulates dopamine, leads to a vicious cycle ending in a herd reaction. It's not a single person. Everybody starts thinking at that lower level of sensationalism and herd instinct. And political and religious campaigns are often run on this basis to instill fear of survival. I'm not talking about religion in terms of religious campaigns, in terms of peace and serenity and life. I'm not talking about that. And it leads to a herd behavior of at the reptilian brain level that affects the majority, that is at election or violence. I will physically show this now. This is the population pyramid, the social, lower economic groups, then the people who are reptilian brained, or they have the other forebrain, but they use only the reptilian brain. A few who are mindful in that majority. The middle level, they also have a little bit, but the majority are using the reptilian brain. And the intellectuals too are using the reptilian brain in terms of sensationalism, racism, and bigotry. And you see the majority is that they are the most vulnerable. The people who think with the reptilian brain are the most vulnerable, but a powerful voter because of the majority. When there is corruption, poor governance, judicial inaction, and impunity, it works together with racism and bigotry. survival of the race and religion becomes a major factor. We see that every day. And then violence becomes a facet. The left hemisphere looks at facts logically and analytically and then sequence it objectively before acting. The primitive reptilian brain that reacts to instinct prevents these logical and mindful processes. In other words, through a primitive limbic system. And I call this a dopaminergic society. I have broken it to dope and others, but it means dopaminergic society. I have specifically done that, right? And then it's like a society standing on one leg with an emotionally charged primitive brain, not active on objective facts, analytical thinking and not using discretion. Can a nation function like this? Not necessarily Sri Lanka. Power seekers want you to act on emotions and the limbic system when it comes to supporting them. They hate the left hemisphere. Most leaders, legal or rebel, work on this principle, starting with Trump, to divide and rule on ethnic or religious lines, marginalizing blacks and the Mexican Wall, as in the US, Brexit in the UK, it's again a part of that thing, and not allowing a mindful thought process. It's time to ponder. I'm finishing. But there are prerequisites, and they are, one is think and take action maybe through nonviolence. It is essential. Make an inner change in you first, as much as possible. You still need to survive. Keep that in mind as well. I don't want to make it religious, but I'm quoting these from philosophers, not religious leaders. Change is never painful. Only the resistance to change is painful. When you stop trying to change others and work on changing yourself, your world changes for better. You cannot believe in God until you believe in yourself. Swami Vivekananda. I'm talking about his philosophical aspects. All tremble at violence, all fear death. Putting oneself in the place of another, one should not kill, nor cause another to kill. Again, Mahatma Gandhi said, non-violence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man. Ila Bhatt, non-violence is not a passive idea, it is an ethical activism at its political best. In other words, you are not passive. Non-violence means not being passive, but taking action in a non-violent way. Reverend Martin Luther King said, we are going to have the kind of vigorous protest. My hope is that it would be non-violent. I would hope that we can avoid riots because riots are self-defeating and socially destructive, which means it leads to a vicious cycle. And finally, if you use non-violence on justice and dignity and peace, use your courage, you are bound to be transformed. Thank you.